Well, and it really has been quite a ride the last couple of years, right? The last 12 to 18 months specifically have been, I think, historically pretty extraordinary. What would your overall assessment of American politics be?
I mean, right now, I think the word that comes to mind is resiliency, right? So we lived through, hopefully, what will be some of our darkest hours for our democracy. I think that a lot of people couldn't imagine. I hearken back to the George W. Bush administration, which people thought was pretty divisive, right? There was opposition to the war in Iraq. No one was prepared for the kind of lightning rod that Donald Trump was in terms of his wantonness, in terms of divisiveness. And so, we managed to live through that, but importantly, we managed to live through, those of us that are here, we managed to live through the 2020 elections, which were historic and epic and enormously important in our democracy, all the while surviving a pandemic, the proportions of which we're still seeing playing out, particularly globally. So those of us that are left standing, I think that we've earned the Boy or Girl Scout badge of resiliency, right? We're still standing after all of those challenges, which have and continue to be significant.
Absolutely. I want to talk for a second about January 6th, 2021. For many of us, right, the full meaning of what's happened and actually what almost happened hasn't been realized yet. What does that date mean for American politics?
So, I mean, I think that, we became accustomed to an increase in both the kind of incendiary rhetoric, but also violence, right? We've seen violent protests for the past several years. And I mean, many of us who have gone to protests throughout our lives, I understand that sometimes, the rhetoric of the chants doesn't really match the sentiment of the folks that are there, right? But what we've seen, particularly during the Trump administration, was this escalation where, yes, the rhetoric was really kind of divisive and violent and incendiary, but now we've seen time after time where it gets violence. And so, do I think that every person who attended that rally was bent on overthrowing the government? Absolutely not. But were there people there whose intention that was? Absolutely. And that's terrifying because of, even those folks who perhaps showed up as Trump supporters, but not necessarily seeking to overthrow the government, but rather register a protest, can easily get caught up in the passions and the kind of circumstances that evolve. And we saw, for the first time in our history, people taking over the Capitol using violent means, destroying public property, being disrespectful to symbols of government, threatening the Vice President of the United States, threatening the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So, I mean, I think that this is enormously substantial, and I think that it's important that we do our best to kind of remember what this stood for. It doesn't mean that it needs to define us, but remember how close we came, because it really was a tremendously vulnerable time in our history.
So would you call it a coup attempt?
Absolutely. I mean, when you have individuals who are seeking to have the election results not certified, when you are seeking, people are chanting, hang the vice president. And it's not that they're standing outside the Capitol peacefully sitting down chanting, hang the vice president, but rather they're storming the Capitol, right? Showing a proclivity toward violence. That's much different than just using the rhetoric. And so, yeah, I do think it was a coup attempt. And, thank God for the heroes that stood up and protected legislators that were able to get the vice president out of the Capitol in a timely fashion. But who knows what would have happened if, the speaker had gone in a different direction, or members of Congress had, or the vice president had. We don't know how that would have wound up. So I think that, you know, some people really do deserve the credit in terms of stepping up and making sure that our government leaders were safe, but we can't ignore the fact that just because the perpetrators weren't successful doesn't mean that it wasn't a legitimate attempt.